in Washington, D.C.
Tonight, trade deal shakeup. The U.S. moves not to renew the USMCA with Canada and Mexico. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer telling Bloomberg there are substantial issues with the agreement. Now annual reviews begin, bringing new uncertainty for companies across North America. Plus, cashing in. President Trump generating at least $1.4 billion from crypto investments in 2025, according to hundreds of pages of financial disclosures. Now, Senator Elizabeth Warren is demanding new guardrails to keep presidents from profiting off crypto while shaping the rules for the industry. We'll get reaction ahead from Republican Congressman Mike Flood of Nebraska. And let it flow. U.S. officials say traffic through the Strait of Hormuz is surging now, boosting oil flows to more than 10 million barrels a day, with military support helping to keep ships moving. The uptick easing fears Iran can squeeze one of the world's most important energy choke points. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lyons.
And Joe, we begin our coverage tonight with the pact that the president once called the, quote, best and most important trade deal ever made. Now, on a 10-year countdown to its end, after the Trump administration said it would not renew the USMCA with Canada and Mexico, opting to conduct annual reviews of the deal instead, injecting even more uncertainty for companies across the country. And joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Alicia Diaz, who spoke with the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer shortly before the news against renewing the deal became public this morning. So, Alicia, the decision not to renew is consequential, surely, but this is just status quo for the next 10 years unless the U.S. were to formally withdraw from this agreement, right?
Exactly. So I think the biggest concern here for companies is that they don't know what comes next. And now we don't know what the next pressure point will be. I asked Ambassador Greer this morning, does that mean that the end of Trump's second term is going to be that next pressure point? It sounds like they do want to reach a deal in the near term, hopefully by the end of this year, if not next year. But still a lot of uncertainty for companies as they try to navigate their supply chains and what the next couple of years will look like for them.
The president has said that the USMCA was really only helpful because it got rid of NAFTA, it replaced NAFTA, and he doesn't see its relevance now. So how will these annual reviews work, and what will we hear following the first one?
It's a great question. And also, as a reminder, we still have another formal round of talks between the U.S. and Mexico coming up in July. So these talks will continue before that annual review, so to speak, that would come next year. However, there's still a lot to discuss, a lot to be shaken out here, and it doesn't help that, as you said, the president has made very clear that he has a disdain for USMCA and he doesn't want to see it continued, and so that really puts pressure on the trading partners as well.
Well, so is the most likely outcome here that it is no longer eventually going to be a trilateral continent-wide agreement or North American-wide agreement, if you will, that it is going to end up with two bilateral trade deals between the United States and our northern and southern neighbors?
That's definitely the path that we're on right now. The U.S. has been only engaging in formal talks with Mexico. Canada hasn't even come to the negotiating table yet. And when I talked to Ambassador Greer this morning, he said there's still a lot to be shaken out in terms of what they're going to do with walking back retaliatory actions that they've had. They still don't have U.S. liquor on some of their shelves in certain provinces, and that's been a real grievance from the U.S. point of view. And so until those things happen, we're completely on these two separate bilateral paths.
All right, Alicia, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Alicia Diaz with our top story, and joining us now on that and more is Republican Congressman Mike Flood of Nebraska, who, of course, chairs the Republican Main Street Caucus. He's a member of the House Financial Services Committee and a familiar voice here on Bloomberg. It's great to have you back on Balance of Power, Congressman. Where's your mind on this? Has NAFTA or the USMCA ever been good for Nebraska, its farmers and manufacturers? Are you with the president on this?
It's been great over the last 10 years. But, you know, under the Biden administration, the Mexican president's wife didn't like white corn. And suddenly we couldn't get the administration at the time to deal with it. The minute Trump got in office, he took care of business. And we are now selling white corn back into Mexico. And this is just one example how the USMCA has benefited our farmers and American businesses. But, hey, as I understand it, and I just talked to our U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer this week, Mexico is engaging in a really good and thoughtful way, and we're seeing encouraging signs from Canada. So this is yet another opportunity for us to make sure that we have the best trade deal in place for America.
We'll obviously look to see what the outcome of bilateral conversations are with Mexico and maybe Canada eventually. I'd also like to ask you, Congressman, as you're joining us from home, from your district, about the early adjournment for the 4th of July recess that we saw yesterday after the Speaker failed to be able to pass a rule to advance the National Defense Authorization Act that had the Save America Act attached to it. How do you see this getting reconciled with your colleagues who want to see that legislation advance in the Senate as well and are willing to disrupt the activity on the floor to do so? What brings it to an end?
Well, it's frustrating. You know, we've been at this for some time. We've passed the Save America Act 3 times. And I think Nick LaLota, one of my colleagues from New York, he said it best. He said, it's like continuing to beat your dog when the neighbors aren't mowing their grass. Like, we're not in charge of the Senate. Like, why are we punishing ourselves here? Why are we, I would never, ever advocate for any animal abuse. He said it as a joke. It was reported. But more than anything, it's like, why are we doing this? Like, we have important business to do here. We have to move the NDAA. We have to be out there taking care of our military and forecasting for them what Congress expects them to be doing. And instead, we have more than a dozen members of the House that want to make this stand when everybody on our side has been voting for this all along. And I just think it doesn't make sense. I totally understand why the Speaker sent us home. We don't need to sit around there when we're willing to do the work. We need to be back in our districts. Let's work this out. Come back when the Senate comes back. Pass the NDAA, keep the appropriations bills moving, keep working to get agreement with the Senate on the Clarity Act, and let them worry about the SAVE Act. It's in their court right now.
I'm glad you mentioned the Clarity Act. There's been a lot of conversation about it, Congressman, and we talk about it a lot on Bloomberg because it's important to our viewers and listeners. Following the president's financial disclosures yesterday, though, brings us back to the whole debate about inserting language to prevent conflict of interest, which I know is important to a lot of Democrats, much like the stablecoin yield issue was important to people on both sides of the aisle. Did this just get more difficult to pass clarity, knowing the likes of Senator Elizabeth Warren and other Democrats will not vote yes unless there's language preventing the executive, in this case Donald Trump, from investing and profiting on crypto?
Well, first of all, every day that you're closer to November is silly season in American politics. Yeah. And so I'm not surprised that Democrats are linking this with their latest effort to make it about Donald Trump. But here's the deal. The digital asset industry...
Just before you talk about Democrats, though, are you fine with these numbers, $1.4 billion in earnings from an industry that the president has pulled back in attempts to regulate, knowing as well that his family owns a massive company in World Financial that's working in this space?
Well, I haven't looked over the disclosures, and as I understand it, he's got other people dealing with his personal finances. He's at work 24 hours a day, it seems like, from where I sit. But listen, the Clarity Act is the entire market structure framework that will allow America to go into the next 100 years as the world's leader, not only in financial services, but in technology and innovation. I voted on it in the House. I'm on the House Financial Services Committee. It answers basic questions like, what is the SEC's role? What is the CFTC's role? What's a commodity? What's a security? It's great to have the stablecoin regime in place, but without clarity, we don't have a network to move this across our country and to really make the rules for most of the rest of the world. So it's very important. And by the way, when it comes to insider trading, anything like that, I am supportive of the bill that's in front of the House. I want to ban that stuff. I want to say we're out of that business. I don't want to be in that business. I don't want to even have the appearance of impropriety. And so I'm a yes on clarity, and I'm a yes on banning stock trading by members of the House and Congress and the government.
If we were to see in the Senate amendments to clarity to cover these ethics provisions and perhaps disallow an executive or his family from operating in the space, would you still be willing to vote in the House on that changed version?
Yeah, I have a very open mind on that. Absolutely.
All right, I'd like to ask you about something else that did successfully make it not just through the House, but the Senate as well. And I know you were instrumental in it, the 21st Century Road to Housing Act. Massive bipartisan majorities saw this pass both chambers, and it has been sent to the president for signature. And repeatedly, Congressman, he suggested he may not sign it, that it seems that he actually has some policy concerns around the legislation. Do you think there's a real chance he vetoes it?
I don't think he's going to veto it. I think it's possible that it becomes law without his signature. His issue is the SAVE Act. His issue is the SAVE Act. He repeats it over and over and over. Every time he talks about housing, he talks about the SAVE Act. He's sending a message. He's really messaging to the U.S. Senate. Listen, everybody on both sides of the aisle, we regard this bill as the biggest step forward toward affordable housing policy in 36 years. And for that reason, I'm very hopeful that it will become law. And I'm going to celebrate it becoming law, whether it has a signature from the White House or not. And I am very focused on celebrating the beginning of this bill becoming law. And I'm not going to let myself go to a place where it gets vetoed, because I haven't been getting those signals. Chairman French Hill hasn't been getting those signals. Speaker Johnson hasn't been getting those signals. So at the place we're at right now, I think it's like July 8th, 9th, 10th, somewhere in there, this bill, as we calculate it, could become law, notwithstanding the president's signature. The last time that happened, I understand it was President Obama at the very end of his term, so it's not unprecedented. I've seen this happen in the state legislature before. So, you know, as a longtime legislator, this is the process. This is how it works, and this is how it plays out sometimes. And then, you know, Donald Trump, we may wake up Sunday morning and he'll say, oh, by the way, I signed that at 3:45 a.m. Nothing would surprise me, right?
So much for the ceremony. Realizing that's the mechanism, to your point, Congressman, it would become law within 10 days of the president's receipt without a signature. Was he wrong to call it a big yawn, though? Does the president understand what's inside this bill, or are lawmakers overselling it?
We are not overselling it. It is a big deal. We know it's a big deal. I am the chairman of the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee. I've been talking to Habitat for Humanity, affordable housing developers, banks, mortgage bankers, home builders, realtors. They know what this bill does. That's why they're so enthusiastically supporting it. Listen, the president is unconventional. If you were looking for a conventional president, the ship sailed on that long time ago. Yeah. He is always looking for different ways to get into the minds and the heads and the voting patterns of, in this case, U.S. senators and the SAVE Act. He has tied this to the SAVE Act. Guess what? Next month, he's going to tie something else to the SAVE Act. And that may prevent something else from passing. I don't know. But I do know this. This bill passed the Senate. It passed the House. It was an arduous process. It was difficult. It was fraught with all sorts of landmines. And we did what the American people want. We passed a substantive housing bill that will bring affordability to Americans' pocketbooks when it comes to their largest expense. And I am hopeful that the president signs it. If he chooses not to, let it become law without his signature. And if it's up to a ceremony, I'll have one in Lincoln, Nebraska, and you're all invited.
Well, thank you very much for that invitation. Congressman, as you talk about how hard fought this was to reach this bipartisan place where lawmakers ultimately were able to get to, how hard fought would a partisan 3.0 budget reconciliation process be? Do you see real chance of that getting through?
I do in the House. It's disheartening every time I hear from the Senate that they don't want to do it. But let me ask you this question. How else are we going to fund the military to replace our munitions that have been used in Iran, the Middle East, and Venezuela? How else are we going to deal with funding the government if they want long TSA lines to make their point before the November election? How else are we going to fight waste, fraud, and abuse in this political environment so close to an election? If not this, then a supplemental. And I will tell you this, if the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Tom Cole, tells our leadership that, listen, we think there's a path forward on a supplemental, by all means, let's invest our time in that. I trust in our chairman of appropriations, and I will gladly follow his recommendation. If he looks at us and says reconciliation is your best shot, then that's where I'm going to put my time and attention. And right now, I think this is a good sign. We're talking about, could a supplemental work? What would both sides want? How would it get 60 votes in the Senate? What would the House Democrat appropriators want in there? That's the way the system should work. We shouldn't be talking about funding the basic business of government in a process created in 1974 called reconciliation. But if we're going to deal with Trump derangement syndrome every single day until the election, we've still got to run the government. We've got to have bullets. We've got to have rockets. We've got to make sure our national security is a priority. And if that's what we're talking about in supplemental, I'm there.
All right, Congressman, thank you for joining us. Republican Congressman Mike Flood of Nebraska.
Thanks for having me.
Now, a short time ago, we learned that tech giant Apple is in talks with the Defense Department to purchase chips from 2 Chinese manufacturers that have been blacklisted by the Pentagon. That is elsewhere in the tech space today. The president praised Micron for the company's $250 million participation in his Trump accounts program. Micron shares, though, were down more than 10% today as we saw a broad sell-off in chip makers and tech stocks. The rotation on display once again. So for more, we turn to power moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda joining us live from World Headquarters in New York. Nora.
A lot of activity happening in the tech market today, especially as we look at the broader stock market. Tech, the worst performing group in the market. So taking a look at Apple, we did see shares of the company up about 1.7%. This as, of course, the company is really eyeing Chinese memory chip companies and a collaboration with some of the blacklisted companies that the Pentagon has on its list. Micron, though, we did see on the downside tumbling for double-digit losses. This despite the fact that Trump had earlier praised the company earlier in the day on Truth Social about its $250 million investment in Trump accounts. This is a stock, though, that had surged more than 300% year-to-date through yesterday's close, so maybe a bit of profit-taking there. But Meta, we did see in the green, up about 9%. And this comes after a Bloomberg exclusive about an AI cloud push with hopes to really challenge the likes of AWS and Google Cloud. But back to the broader market, we are seeing the market falling on the first trading day of the third quarter. We did get some economic data, manufacturing data that showed that a 6th straight month of expansion. So we saw traders weighing that economic data also in alongside comments from Kevin Warsh of the Fed saying that inflation risks are easing. So we did see this really playing out in the broader market with the S&P 500 lower by about 0.2%. The Nasdaq 100 really taking a beating, down about 1.5%, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average ending just below flat.
Nora, thank you so much, as always. Bloomberg's Nora Melinda with Power Moves. We thank you. Coming up, U.S.-Iran talks in Doha end without a breakthrough, as tensions in the Gulf put new focus on America's military readiness. We're going to get into this ahead with an expert, Michael Cadenazzi, Assistant Secretary for Industrial Base Policy at the Pentagon, in our studio next here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You can only each year on year spend so much more because you have to find and hire and contract men and women in uniform, and obviously you have to work very hard, and the US is doing that, Europe is doing that, on expanding the output of the defense industrial base, which at the moment on both sides of the Atlantic is simply not producing enough. So the president is now meeting with the bosses of the big defense industrial companies in the United States to again make that argument.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew. And that was NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte speaking with us last week following his Oval Office meeting with President Trump. The Secretary General addressing the efforts underway by NATO allies, including the U.S., to invest more in their defense industrial bases. And here to discuss this further is Michael Cadenazzi, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Base Policy, who leads the Pentagon's efforts to secure the supply of materials critical to U.S. national security. Mr. Assistant Secretary, thank you for being with us. As we consider the effort to invest in and expand the defense industrial base, where is the biggest challenge? Is it labor? Is it production capacity? Is it accessing things like critical minerals?
There's multiple challenges. I think the way I would frame it is fragility of the defense industrial base has been a challenge as a result of essentially 3 decades of not neglect, but lack of attention to capacity. We've done a lot of things to outsource and to become dependent on other countries for parts of our industrial base overall. We've struggled to go ahead and find opportunities to go ahead and improve that by bringing back manufacturing over the past 3 decades. Now this team under this president has been really committed to the reindustrialized agenda. It's been a topic for the president for a long time, and it's been focus of the team here and the administration to sort of put this at the top of the agenda. The industrial base is at the heart of the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. We have an incredible array of resources and, more than anything else, leadership support to drive change. And so I think the idea of dealing with problems like bottlenecks, single sources, they're the natural result of the tendencies that have happened over the past couple of years. We're trying to change that and reverse course. And that includes things like addressing minerals challenges. We've also seen a couple generations worth of people undervalue the workforce and the skilled trades. We need to spend more time to do that. In fact, we're launching a new program called Build Freedom to go ahead and accelerate the growth of and hiring in skilled trades across the country, which is an exciting thing we're going to launch tomorrow in the Pentagon.
Interesting. Just in tomorrow, fascinating. This is after the president invoked the Defense Production Act around munitions bottlenecks, which is right down the middle for you here. To give the Pentagon, at the time, you said to communicate and leverage industry. To what extent does that bring certainty to the primes, to the big defense contractors who have to lay out a lot of R&D and a lot of money on a major weapons program that they need to see years into the future?
We understand that for a long time, a variable demand signal that was uncertain has been hindering defense industry's investment into their supply chains and their own factories. And so one of the things that the department has been working on is stabilizing a long-term demand signal. This is something that, if you go and read the 10Ks of every CEO's report for defense companies for the past 2 decades, they say if only DOW would go ahead and stabilize its demand, we'd invest more. So we've met them in that challenge in partnership with the Congress, which has given us a whole bunch of new authorities to go ahead and lock in multi-year procurements, 5-year deals, 7-year deals.
So that's unlocking investment on their part, right?
Absolutely.
That CapEx is flowing because of this.
Absolutely. They're making commitments to respond to the demand signal because they know that they need to ramp. We also need to ramp up the production volumes. And so that's included in the process as well.
Well, as we're talking about these longer-term contracts, though, how do you balance the changing face of war, if you will? Take the conflict with Iran, which I won't ask you to speak on directly, but it has shown that you can see cheap things like drones being shot down by more expensive munitions that we have. How do you focus on that and how the future of war may be different while also making sure we can stand up against an adversary like Russia or China if it were necessary? So
luckily in the national security sense, we have a very robust apparatus in the Pentagon driven by the Joint Chiefs of Staff through the services and the combatant commanders overseas that define what we need to buy. And so they're the ones that sort of make those decisions. It's our job in industrial-based policy to make sure that industry can meet those needs, to meet the warfighters' requirements for delivering those capabilities. And so there's a mix of capabilities we've invested in at every end, from the highest level, think your F-35s and those kind of classified programs, down to very simple things like bullets. All of them require materials, minerals, electronics, workforce. We are working all those relentlessly across the department to make sure that we can meet the capacity needs for the team.
We're about to get into a big debate here about military spending in this country, in this town. In fact, it's already underway with the NDAA starting to move here, despite challenges we just discussed with the Congressman. $1.5 trillion is what the president is asking for. Have you already spent that money in your head? And is this a new normal? Is this the new level for defense spending, or a one-off investment?
So I think the way that I'd frame it is that the president's team has recognized the need for substantially higher top line for defense to get after the many challenges we have, of which the reindustrialization of the DIB, or the defense industrial base, is a critical part of it. But there are many things. We want to deal with personnel issues. There's infrastructure issues. You've heard about Secretary Hegseth's Barracks Task Force, those other kind of initiatives that are going on. There are environmental issues we're trying to deal with as well. We need to go ahead and respond on multiple avenues. And we think that at $1.5 trillion, and we're excited to be partnering with the Congress to make that happen, we'll have the resources we need to go ahead and do that. I think going forward, we'd anticipate that while we close substantial number of gaps at this current budget, when it comes through in 27, that we'll see more opportunities for spending higher levels in the future.
Really interesting. Speaking to us from the heart of the DIB, Michael Cadenazzi, we thank you. Come back, Secretary, with more as you learn it. Coming up, the latest financial disclosures from the president, starting a whole new debate here in Washington. We'll have that next, only on Bloomberg. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we're learning more about the extent of President Trump's financial dealings after hundreds of millions of dollars in trades were disclosed. And as we told you around this time yesterday, over $1.4 billion in earnings, not holdings, earnings from crypto ventures, reporting more crypto-related income than any publicly traded U.S. digital asset company earned last year, making President Trump one of the industry's biggest boosters. Or winners. The disclosures have renewed ethics complaints from congressional Democrats and watchdogs alike. Bloomberg White House correspondent Jeff Mason joins us in our Washington bureau. It's great to see you, Jeff. You wonder what the president has unleashed here. A statement from Elizabeth Warren says the crypto legislation heading to the Senate floor, this is clarity, must prevent the president and family from profiting off the crypto industry. If it does not, it will only turbocharge Donald Trump's brazen crypto corruption. Is that true?
Well, it's not my job to say whether that's true or not, but I will say that
my job to ask.
It's your job to ask. Well done. It is certainly creating room for criticism, and it's not surprising that Elizabeth Warren, Senator Warren, is leading that charge. The president has transformed his own fortunes since coming into since coming into office, and that is undeniable based on the figures that we've seen, and transformed it mostly through cryptocurrency. If there's a few other nuggets in the report that came out last night about money he's made from settlements with media companies, of course, his other properties, Mar-a-Lago, and the other golf courses he has. But the vast majority of that wealth came from crypto. And at a time when his administration, led, of course, by him, has pulled back on regulation of the crypto industry, and that has helped his family and has helped his fortune.
Well, we were told multiple times by guests on this program yesterday that the president was already a rich man. Yes, he's gotten significantly richer in this second term, but the country knew that already. And I just wonder what your view is on the political consequence here, really, if any.
Well, I think if any is the key part of that question. I mean, the president is someone who I've covered since 2016, and he has said and done and now earned things, amounts, statements, that whole kind of gamut of things that would normally bring down a more traditional politician. And it doesn't in this case. And he's in office now, and he doesn't have the opportunity to run for another term. So would it potentially hurt him if he was if we were in a situation in Washington where Democrats control both houses of Congress? Sure. Probably there'd be investigations. But that's not the case now either. So I don't want to say there will be no consequences, but the potential for political consequences are much lower than they would be in a different situation.
As far as legal consequences, he's broken no laws here, right? We should stipulate that as far as we see in these disclosures, there is no illegal activity. Could he have set a precedent for the president?
No evidence of illegal activity. I'm sure people like Elizabeth Warren would be looking for that.
Why would the next president come along and try to make $1 billion on crypto then?
And I think your question about precedent is a good one. I mean, that is what is different here, is that this is someone who came into office and did not say, I'm not going to benefit, I'm putting all of my money into a blind trust. It is the case with him that his sons oversee his financial world, but he benefits from it. The wealth still accrues to him.
All right. Bloomberg's Jeff Mason, thank you very much, as always, for joining us. And now for more on this, joining us is Richard Painter, former White House ethics lawyer for the George W. Bush administration. Richard, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. I'll begin by asking you the very same thing Joe asked Jeff. There is a distinction here between what is legal and maybe what is ethical. Has the president done anything illegal?
Well, if there's any foreign government money coming into these crypto ventures, that would violate the Foreign Emoluments Clause of the United States Constitution. For example, with Liberty Financial, apparently the United Arab Emirates invested a significant amount of money. If that is sovereign wealth fund money, and then President Trump is getting emoluments, defined as profits and benefits in the dictionary at the time of the founding of our country and the drafting of the Emoluments Clause, profits and benefits. Then from that money invested in Liberty Financial by the United Arab Emirates, that would be a violation of the Foreign Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. Now, it's, of course, up to Congress to enforce the Foreign Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, and we've had this issue ever since 2017 in his first term. That Congress is very slow to do that, and it's very, very difficult for private plaintiffs to get the courts to enforce the Foreign Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. That's the main legal prohibition. Now, otherwise, it may be legal, but it's a serious, serious conflict of interest. Now, the same man is in charge of regulating the economy and the agencies that regulate the economy, including cryptocurrency, and he's putting out executive orders that are liberalizing the cryptocurrency markets and maybe inflating asset prices while he's holding on to billions of dollars worth of crypto assets. That's a clear conflict of interest, even if he's allowed to do it.
Okay, fascinating. Well, look, it's possible that Congress changes hands in terms of which party is in power in November. Richard, is the enforcement mechanism then impeachment?
Well, they could try that for a third time, but we all know what happens over in this when they don't have the 2/3 necessary to remove the president from office. So they may try that. And what we really need is a commitment in both political parties to much higher standards of ethics. We had an opportunity in 2021, after Donald Trump left office, to pass legislation that would have prevented presidents and vice presidents and members of Congress from having financial conflicts of interest, including stock trading by members of Congress. And quite a few Republicans opposed that legislation because they still supported Donald Trump. But also Nancy Pelosi opposed that legislation. Her husband was trading in the stocks. So we had a situation after the first Trump administration where there was an unwillingness to commit to higher standards of ethics in both political parties and also to restrain presidential power. And there were other illustrations of this as well. I mean, this idea of the president's family somehow getting wealthy off the presidency, which Don Jr. and Eric Trump have done fabulously well at that. But Hunter Biden was trying some of the same stuff. Now, Hunter Biden really was pretty bad at it. Never made much money off the presidency, even the vice presidency, with that Ukrainian gas company. But I got to say, the Democrats who try to apologize for that or justify Hunter Biden and say, oh, well, he's an adult son, the president can't control him. Well, now you see the Trump boys are out there making 100 times as much money as Hunter Biden ever dreamed of making. We need both political parties to say this is unacceptable, this kind of conduct. It should not be tolerated by the president, shouldn't be tolerated by Congress. I don't care which political party the president is, but Donald Trump has been by far the worst when it comes to personal financial conflicts of interest in office.
Well, so when we consider, and I understand your points on the elected members of government in Congress and in the White House, I wonder about the role that the judicial branch, specifically the Supreme Court, plays here, knowing that this court handed down a decision on presidential immunity around acts taken while in office. Even if there were to be some violation of the law beyond impeachment in Congress pursuing that, is there actually legal recourse for any occupant in the White House, no matter what party, to face legal consequences if they were to decide to break the law around their financial dealings?
Well, you're exactly right. In addition to Congress and the president, the Supreme Court has been part of the problem. I have a book that just was published a month ago called Conduct Unbecoming, about the ethics crisis in the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court justices have the attitude that they get to do whatever they want when it comes to financial conflicts of interest and ethics. And, oh, by the way, the president gets to do whatever he wants. And in Trump versus United States, they handed down the opinion that the president cannot be prosecuted for official capacity crimes or has immunity, a very strong presumption of immunity. So this could make criminal prosecution very, very difficult. Doesn't make impeachment impossible. The only thing that's making impeachment impossible is the 2/3 of the Senate that you need to remove a president. We did force Richard Nixon out of office back in 1974. The Republican Party finally was willing to stand up to him. But we're just not in that situation right now. At some point, the voters need to make their views clear that these financial conflicts of interest of the president are not to be tolerated. And when you get back to cryptocurrency, this could have a very detrimental impact on the economy if cryptocurrency asset values become inflated and starts to absorb an ever larger portion of the economy. We aren't where we were with mortgage-backed securities before the 2008 financial crisis. We have nowhere near the market capitalization of crypto, but we could get there, and we could end up with a government-sponsored pump and dump that benefits the office holders, whether it's the president or the members of Congress who are trading themselves at the expense of the entire economy. And I think voters need to start to focus on this.
That would be quite a moment. Richard, the president flew a new jet today to North Dakota. You might have seen the new Air Force One, gifted by Qatar at the value of $400 million. The president making the case again today that he asked for the plane, and he'll be taking it with him, apparently. It'll be going into his presidential library unless he decides to fly it around for a while. I'm curious. I know that the Secret Service has gone through this jet and has made it secure for the President of the United States. But how would you have handled this, Richard Painter, if George W. Bush asked you if he could take a gifted 747 from a Middle Eastern ally?
I would have said that he can't do it. The same thing the founders of our country said in the Foreign Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. No person holding a position of trust with the United States government can accept a gift from a foreign country, period. And he could not accept that plane. And he said he wants to take it with him to his personal presidential library. That's a gift to the president from a foreign country. And I don't know whether they're really an ally of ours or not. I mean, they let us have some bases or whatever. They're also giving a bunch of money to Hamas, playing both sides of things, and then dragging us into this Middle East war with Iran and egging that on. And I'm not sure that the government of Qatar has the interests of the United States in mind at all. And that plane came with a message that President Trump was expected to do what the government of Qatar wants him to do. And that's exactly what the founders of our country, when they drafted the Emoluments Clause, didn't want happening. The plane ought to get returned. And by the way, a couple of $100 million of our taxpayer money was apparently spent refurbishing the plane. So I don't know how we came out ahead on that one at all. And we'll have to come up with another plane for the next president.
That does appear to be the case. Richard, thank you for joining us. Richard Painter, we will give you a call if we learn more about all of this. And thanks for being with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up on Balance of Power, Colorado puts the Democratic Party's divide on display. Progressives score a major House upset, while some familiar names hold their ground. We'll break it all down next with our political panel on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Remarkable upset in Colorado as a 29-year-old Democratic socialist named Milat Quiros managed to beat veteran Congresswoman Diana DeGette, who has held the state's 1st district seat since before Quiros was born. The 15-term incumbent saying in a statement that she strove to collaborate with colleagues on both sides of the aisle. But, quote, in our toxic political climate, there seems to be little room for that type of politician anymore, unquote. And while Democratic Senator John Hickenlooper successfully fought off a challenge from his left, fellow Democratic Senator Michael Bennet lost his bid for governor when state AG Phil Weiser managed to win that primary, dispatching a 3-term incumbent who Weiser framed as not being tough enough on Trump. Bennet will remain in the Senate through his term in 2028.
So let's get more reaction to yesterday's primaries with our political panel. Democratic strategist Megan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden, alongside Republican strategist David Avella, who is the chair of GOPAC. Welcome to you both. Megan, to begin with you as the Democrat, when we had conversations around the results of New York's primary last week, when we saw multiple Democratic socialists victorious, there was a lot of Democrats saying, look, New York is not the country. If it spreads to Colorado, if it could spread to somewhere like Michigan, is this actually just the trajectory your party is going in?
No, this is 4 people that have gotten elected to the DSA from 435 just in the House. That's less than 1%. These are people who are turning blue districts bluer, right? So they are not going to impact the majority. They are not people who are going to help the Democrats take back the House. Those are people in these moderate districts like New York 17, in Utah 1. And I would caution people not to overcrank on some of this. Also, people need to understand, some of these members, I think, are going to need a little bit of a civics lesson, that they are not going to be able to impact some or implement some of their ideas. They're going to have to learn how to moderate and work with other people because their ideas, again, are for campaigning and not for governing.
Now, David, it's your job now to tell us that this is a national trend, connecting the dots from coast to coast. Whether or not you feel that way, is there an anti-incumbency component to this, or is it about simply the extremes In this case of the Democratic Party taking over.
You're seeing two things at work here. It's the Biden impact, and you have a generation of younger Democrats who say, we cannot continue with the crowd we've had for the last 40 years. It's time for a new group. And so you're seeing some of that. And the other part of this is it's the Bernie Sanders legacy, that he decided, look, I can't be president. I can't get democratic socialism moving forward. So I'm going to elect a whole generation of leaders who are going to believe like me and get elected to office.
He did endorse these candidates, yeah.
Absolutely. Every one of them have been endorsed by him, had money raised by him. This is Bernie 2.0.
Wow.
And also, to be fair, Bernie Sanders also has like a 70% loss rate in people he's endorsed. So just to also be clear about that.
Donald Trump always said he feared Bernie Sanders more than any of the other Democrats, Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden, he ran against.
Yeah, it's incredible to consider. And to your point, Megan, about this being blue districts turning bluer, they aren't the make or breakers of getting elected to a majority. But could they make or break the power of the majority? Couldn't these members be the ones that make Hakeem Jeffries' job most difficult if he's to be speaker?
Yeah, absolutely. But I also think that's how you lose your reelection campaign, because people want people to do things in Washington. That's part of this anti-incumbency trend that we're seeing both from Republicans and Democrats. They want people to do things for them. They want Washington to work for them. They don't want to shut down the government like we did several times in the last Congress. And so if they're going to be obstructionists in the Democratic Party, one, it'll be interesting to see what committees they're put on. It'll be interesting to see even if they vote for Jeffries as speaker, but also they will get voted out if they are not working for their constituents. I think that is like the very clear message that is being sent across the board here.
There's some really interesting trends that are forming. The one we're discussing here, anti-incumbency, the Supreme Court ruling yesterday addressing finances and the lopsided money contest, apparently favoring Republicans even more now with this throwing out of federal limits on the coordination of spending between committees and candidates. Are you feeling more or less optimistic than you were when it seemed that redistricting, for instance, was a wash?
I think there is a upside to the party having more control and being able to help the candidates. It will ultimately impact those candidates who aren't in the top tier or not even in the second tier, but those third tier candidates that probably now won't get as much support because the committees will put it in the higher tiers because now there's no limit. And that when there was a limit and you had to spread your money to more candidates, it helped more.
How about that? So there could be a downside in electoral results.
For some of the candidates, it will be. I mean, there's still, the outside groups that will be able to be helpful. And, ultimately, it does give a little more control to the party. And if you're Hakeem Jeffries, you need that because these candidates that are winning these primaries are going to cause problems in competitive districts for him. That it is their anti-police, higher taxes message that competitive districts are going to have to, Democrats are going to have to defend to say either you're for it, which you're going to turn off moderate voters, or you're against it and you're going to turn off base voters. So Hakeem Jeffries' problems start far sooner than if he were to somehow get them in his caucus.
Well, this is on the House side, and especially as we consider where money is going to be spent, I want to ask about competitive Senate races as well, because we got new polling from the New York Times and Siena on 6 states that Republicans currently hold a Senate seat that Democrats have the best shot of flipping. All 6 are close enough to be competitive, though in this poll right now, only 2, Maine and North Carolina, currently have the Democratic nominee in the lead. Does that hearten you as a Republican that it's only 2 and they need 4 to make a majority, or does that make you nervous because they're all effectively getting close to the margin of error?
Let me say this about Susan Collins.
Okay.
She wins by an average of 18 points.
That's a prediction.
In 2000, that's right. Historically, she's won by 18 points. In 2000, with the president on the ballot in Maine, every poll going into Election Day said she would lose by 4. She won by 8. Now, my simple West Virginia math tells me that's a 12-point swing. Susan Collins is not losing against Plattner. 1. North Carolina is going to be a fight, but we've always known that. And what people don't talk about, or what D.C.'s not talking about, is that don't count John Sununu out, or don't count Chris Sununu out in New Hampshire. Sununu's have run New Hampshire for quite some time. There would be a pickup opportunity. And if Said wins in Michigan, Mike Rogers' chance go up dramatically. So now it's 2 seats Republicans may be picking up come November.
Well, right now, Megan Hayes is picking up her club. There are a couple of states that jump off. Texas, are you kidding me? Talrico, you've got a Democrat tied with a Republican, but also Maine. To see Plattner with a 2-point lead, granted, that's, within any realistic margin. After all of the talk of scandal, tells you what?
it tells me that there's probably more op research to come. And I do agree with everything he is saying on the map. I don't think that we pick up Maine. And I do think that we have to be careful in places like New Hampshire and Michigan that we have Democratic senators right there. I just think that this will, seeing Texas and Ohio and North Carolina and places like Iowa back in the mix, that's huge for Democrats. It's huge leading into the 28 cycle. And I'm not sure that Democrats will take back the Senate, but it is a lot of these places that they will pick up purple seats in Congress, and it will make the margin bigger in the House.
Well, so when we consider a state like North Carolina, which I think Democrats that we speak with are feeling perhaps most confident about that flip, in the light of the Supreme Court decision that is going to allow more coordination with the party committees, does that actually potentially be something that makes it more difficult for Cooper to beat Wadley? No,
Roy Cooper has a ton of money. He also has a ton of support. He has a ton of bipartisan support. He's won statewide there multiple times. And there's only so much ads you can buy. There's only so much airtime out there. So I think that this is just going to be an actual hard-fought race, and it will see where people land. I think that this is where the Trump factor will play in a place like North Carolina, because I do think people in North Carolina, they are a bipartisan state. Their economy is suffering in a lot of ways. I mean, we were just down there talking to the chamber, and you hear they just want people to work for them. They have a bipartisan local house, and they have a separate divided government. And North Carolina will be like a traditional Senate race, and it'll be a hard-fought race on both sides.
An interesting race that is developing to watch is the Alaska Senate race. Yeah. Because you have Senator Dan Sullivan and another Dan Sullivan.
How can that be allowed? He's even copying the logo from the incumbent.
There's no laws against that, right? There's no copyright on those logos, but it's going to make Senator Sullivan's going to have to work on this one.
Well, I guess that's true. Maybe we need to go up there and find out for ourselves.
That would be a fun balance of power field trip. Just quickly, as we consider some of these vulnerable incumbent senators, when you have President Trump openly calling for the firing of the Senate parliamentarian once again today, really wanting to see the Save America Act passed. I know that an original narrow version did get 50 votes in the Senate. As we get closer to the midterms, are there even going to be 50 votes on a controversial piece of legislation like that?
Time will tell, right? I don't know. Let me just say this. I suspect that the Senate and House leaders take counsel from the president, but just as I'm sure the president takes counsel from them when they say, hey, you should fire this staffer, right?
Yeah, maybe not so much. Although,
that's exactly
the store could be closed from here, and I just wonder if it reopens to fund the government or if we're heading for a shutdown at the end of September.
Why are we talking about
how to deflate
We're not shutting the government down.
Yeah. Again, if you don't have a way to open it, why are you shutting it down? Again, why are we doing this? But I will say on the SAVE Act, if Republicans thought that would actually help them win elections, that bill would be passed. So I don't understand why the president doesn't get that.
We need another 10 minutes. You guys are great. Megan Hayes, David Avella, thank you so much for your insights, and thanks for being part of our program. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find it on the terminal and online for all the stories we've been talking about.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll see you back here tomorrow for a Thursday Jobs Day on Bloomberg TV and radio.